Okay, so thank you all for coming. We have three expert and informed panelists here to talk about developments in Ukraine. I will apologize right up front because I think the title of today's event very much understates the situation that we're discussing. Recent developments in Ukraine, I think, do not convey all of the import of the maneuverings that have been going on. I'll briefly highlight a few so that I can tee up our panelists for discussion. You may have read about the developments in Strasbourg with the Council of Europe, the Parliamentary Assembly decision to reinstate the Russian delegation's voting privileges. They did this over the objections of Ukraine shortly after having met with President Zelensky, who, if we can believe what he said in the aftermath, he urged that the Council of Europe not take this step. So what the implications this might have for the relationship between Ukraine, Europe, Russia, and the United States, I think, remain to be seen. And I'll be interested in hearing the views of our panelists on this. Meanwhile, the Russians announced that they had proposed to Ukraine that they enter negotiations over returning the captured seamen from the Kerch Strait incident of many months ago that had been detained in Russia. And apparently the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry refused to discuss this issue. And shortly thereafter, President Zelensky announced that the Ukrainian MFA had not, in fact, consulted with him about this response, and he was not pleased with what had happened. The third interesting development is going on in Japan, not too far in the distant future. President Trump will be meeting with President Putin. And part of why that's interesting is that President Trump had canceled a planned meeting with President Putin several months ago, specifically over Russia's detention of the Ukrainian seamen, saying that he would not meet with Putin until such time as those seamen had been returned, and yet this meeting is going on nonetheless, although Russia continues to detain them. So all of this is going on in the surface. Meanwhile, in the background, we've got a continued war going on in eastern Ukraine, a brand new president elected in Ukraine who campaigned on ending that war and restoring the country to peace and harmony. So how all this is going to play out, I think, is something that is not immediately evident to outside observers. So we have here today three experts on this. To my far right, Keith Darden is a professor at American University, and I think one of our country's best informed and most insightful experts on Ukraine. To my immediate right, Sam Charap of the RAND Corporation, author of an excellent book on the war going on between Russia and Ukraine called Everyone Loses, which I think was a very accurately put title. And to my left, Jacob Heilbrunn is the editor of The National Interest and our center's resident expert on European matters, who will be talking a little bit about what the thinking is in Europe regarding Ukraine, its decision to readmit Russia to the Council of Europe, and what the dynamics might be among Europe, Russia, the United States, and Ukraine going forward. So I'll turn first to Sam.
Great. Thank you, George. Thank you all for coming. So I'll start with good news, which in the case of Ukraine is sometimes the last thing you hear. But I think we can say that the only direction is up. Given how bad the situation has become, broadly speaking, in both in the context of the conflict and Ukraine's politics. Don't take my word for it. Ukrainians themselves, only 9% of them in 2018 trusted their government, which was the lowest number of all countries surveyed in the world by Gallup. 91% said that corruption was widespread. And from 2014 to 2017, which was before the EU allowed for visa-free travel for Ukrainians, 25%, that is 1 out of 4, working age, economically active citizens, so that doesn't include students, pensioners, mothers on maternity leave, or those disabled and unable to work, left Ukraine for employment abroad. It's quite extraordinary. And of course, the war in the East certainly contributed to these trends and this view. So I'm going to focus briefly on the prospects of movement on settlement under Ukraine's new president. So, first thing to note is that there is widespread popular support for a settlement of the Donbas conflict, and that the conflict itself is very important for most Ukrainians. So a poll in May found that 75% of Ukrainians are in favor of direct negotiations with Russia for restoring peace to the Donbas. And 55% are in favor of direct negotiations with the separatist leaders for that same purpose. So clear majorities in favor of that. But also 65% of respondents said that Ukraine should make compromises in order to restore peace and return the lost territory, so to speak, to Ukraine, with only 21% of Ukrainians saying that compromise is unacceptable. Meanwhile, in two different polls show that about 50% of Ukrainians support giving autonomy to the separatist regions in order to achieve a settlement, which is, of course, one of the conditions of the Minsk agreements. And in a survey which asked Ukrainians what are the most important problems for you, by a significant number, the conflict in the East ranks higher than all others, including salaries, the increase in communal and utility prices, and inflation. And even perhaps most shockingly, over half of Ukrainians view Russia positively, 57% in a February 2019 poll, which is, after 5 years of war, an extraordinary number. So my third point is that Volodymyr Zelensky was elected on a platform that gives him much more opportunity to make compromises along the lines that would be consistent with the polling data I just cited to achieve peace. Particularly compared to his opponent in the second round, the then incumbent Petro Poroshenko. And there are a variety of reasons for that, which we can get into. But so far, we've only seen the faintest hints of policy change. And I think it's now become clear that the real Zelensky, so to speak, will only really know what his plan is after the snap parliamentary elections that have been called for the 21st of July are over, and there is a new government, likely with reflecting a significant, a coalition in the Rada that he has significant control over via the party that has just been created, Servant of the People, named after his famous television show. But we have seen, from what we have seen so far, it's clear that there are not going to be significant changes to the status quo until that time. He does seem to be nervous about the consequences, the political consequences of changing policy before the election. And as George alluded to, he doesn't really have full control over his own government, and I'm including in that the ministries that by the Constitution he should have control over, in this case the foreign ministry. And that probably extends down to control over the armed forces and the other, not only the formal military, but the other forces on the ground in the Donbass who are involved in the conflict, some of which answer to the Ministry of Interior. So as George mentioned, the press conference today where Zelensky revealed this dispute with his own foreign minister, who of course is a holdover from Poroshenko. But he started by noting that the Rada won't accept Foreign Minister Klimkin's resignation. He wants to replace Klimkin. He's already nominated Vadim Pustaiko, who's most recently Ukraine's ambassador to NATO and used to be the DCM here, actually. But the Rada refuses to move ahead on that, and Zelensky denounced that as sort of one of many things that the Rada is blocking in terms of his own initiatives, which is also true, given that a lot of the laws and initiatives that he's put forward have not been moved by the Rada, which is of course set to change pretty dramatically, as we'll hear from Keith next month. So he, as he said in this press conference today, he hears about Ukrainian foreign policy decisions through the internet, but I think there's something telling about the nature of his dispute with the minister and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and maybe something that reveals a bit more about how we can expect Zelensky to approach the conflict, relations with Russia, and foreign policy more generally. The details of this Russian offer are a little bit murky. From what we understand, there was a note passed from the Russian Foreign Ministry to the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry asking for written guarantees that in return for some sort of release, it wasn't clear if the sailors would be released to Ukraine or out of detention in Russia, that Ukraine would provide guarantees that they would be prosecuted under Russian law. Something along those lines. It's a little bit murky. And the MFA's reaction was to say, you must comply with the International Tribunal decision that stated that Russia needs to return them. From what I can understand of this interaction, basically Russia was trying to uphold its legal position that the court had no jurisdiction, while at the same time essentially giving a way out to some sort of partial release or perhaps even full release of the sailors themselves. But the MFA's position was basically, unless Russia complies with all the, unless it basically capitulates on its international legal positions, whatever one might think of them, we're not interested in the return of the sailors. And Zelensky's approach was basically, his emphasis was on getting the sailors back. He even appealed directly to Putin, saying, we all have children. Return, these boys home. A much less ideological and more pragmatic approach, which perhaps portends some changes to come, given how ideological and sort of overly principled some of the previous policies on this issue were. But thus far, rhetoric on all of the key issues in Ukraine's foreign policy have been largely the same as Poroshenko's, and this was on full display when Zelensky made his first visits to European capitals, to Berlin, Paris, and Brussels, where he maintained a number of, not just the general line about NATO and EU membership and the relationship with Russia and attitude towards Russia being what it is, but even the Ukrainian policy on opposing Nord Stream 2 in the German case, or and trying to prevent or opposing the return of Russia to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Even Macron, in the press conference where the two of them came out, said that Zelensky had agreed to a ceasefire, to pursue a ceasefire and negotiations with the separatists as a gesture, and Zelensky sort of stopped the press conference and said, actually, that's not what I said. We only agree to work within the Minsk format. And by the way, within the Minsk format, there are negotiations with separatist representatives, so it wasn't clear what the distinction was, but nonetheless, I think trying to make it avoid being seen to make any rhetorical divergences from existing policy. That said, there has been, he hasn't used the same extent of hardline rhetoric on the conflict itself, but he of course has largely avoided addressing it in any detail, along with pretty much everything else. Since he's become president, there hasn't been much by way of detailed policy pronouncements. For the moment, it seems to me that means he's playing to elite preferences. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, there does seem to be popular support for a change in the Ukrainian approach to the Donbass. But clearly, either there hasn't been a calculus or there has been a calculus made that, I mean, I think there has been a calculus made that, that the electoral politics of more actively pursuing a settlement on the Donbass don't work for achieving the outcome that he wants in the election, or that he's simply playing elite politics on foreign policy and the conflict, and sort of not playing to the mass popular moods. It would seem to me that as a result, he risks potentially losing some votes to the opposition platform, the sort of post-Party of Regions party, which is already polling second, behind, as Keith will get into, behind his party. And it is true, of course, that the political elite is opposed to the kind of policies that the Ukrainian public seems to want. Just to give a couple of examples, the military prosecutor general is looking into charging Zelensky's press secretary for saying that perhaps Ukrainian soldiers might have been lured into shooting at civilian targets in the context of the back and forth that goes on the line of contact daily. Or the prosecutor general examining the statements of ex-president and current Ukrainian representative in the Minsk Trilateral Contact Group, Kuchma, about the possibility that Ukrainian forces might not return fire. These somehow crossing not only a political, but in at least the view of these two prosecutors, legal red lines. Unclear where those will go in any case. I should note that there has been at least one small positive step on the ground that we've seen within the last 24 hours, although the agreement to do so was made in early June, and that is disengagement from the town of Stanica Luganska in the Luhansk region, where one of the only crossing point in on the line of contact in Luhansk is, and where the opposing forces had grown incredibly close, and as a result were essentially involved in firefights that put in danger the average citizens who were crossing the line for personal reasons daily, and made what was already quite a treacherous journey even more dangerous. And although the agreement to disengage had actually been negotiated in 2016, believe it or not, it actually began to be implemented yesterday. And even on that, though, there has been significant pushback within Kiev. In terms of Russia's view of all this, it does seem to me that they're distinctly in Moscow unimpressed by Zelensky's performance thus far, and given him really no opportunities nothing to run with, so to speak, particularly by making the announcement of the issuance of passports to residents of the separatist areas so soon after his election. It's clear that I think Moscow wants to see significant change in Ukrainian policy and has little patience for Ukraine's domestic political calendar in terms of waiting until after the parliamentary elections. Meanwhile, it does seem that Russia is doing its best to support the main pro-Russian opposition party, the opposition platform that I mentioned. We can see today that Viktor Medvedchuk, who Zelensky, who's Putin, a close confidant of Putin, but also a interlocutor between the Poroshenko administration, or intermediary between the Poroshenko administration and the Russian government, whose services Zelensky has said he does not need, is now playing the role of unauthorized mediator, and today sort of miraculously managed to free, or at least said he did, 4 Ukrainians from captivity in the Donbass, somehow right before the elections, as Zelensky put it, ironically. So it's clear, I think, that Moscow is not in a rush to sort of take the first step on this issue. I think the calculus is that time is on Russia's side. Even if you look at the nature of the polling now, we're likely to have a bigger pro-Russian faction in the parliament, in the next parliament than we do in this one, which might, I think, improve situations from Moscow's perspective. So waiting doesn't hurt, and I don't think that there's a need felt in Moscow to make concessions at this point, given that they see no change yet either. So the prospects for a settlement after the dust settles in Ukrainian domestic politics remain unclear at best. The only game in town are the Minsk agreements, but there seems to be a view that the constitutional changes required to actually implement it will be almost impossible under any potential political configuration. And it's unclear how much Moscow is willing to compromise on that. It's also unclear how far Zelensky is prepared to prioritize this and to use his political capital that he will have after the parliamentary elections to achieve a settlement. But to return to where I started in terms of good news, I think it is fair to say that the prospects, even if unclear and perhaps low probability, are better than they would have been under a Poroshenko presidency, a second term of Poroshenko. So I'll leave it there.
All right, thank you, Sam. Keith?
Thanks. I'm even more positive on Ukraine, which is atypical for me. But I would say there's a lot of good news here, and that in many ways this election put the lie to a caricature that was circulating about Ukraine, both here in Washington and European capitals, which was, a country that was united in its resistance to Russia, engaging in a, consensual nation building, reviving its national language, creating a unified Orthodox church that was autocephalous and separated from Moscow, and working as hard as it possibly could to separate itself from the Russian Federation, and unwilling to yield in any way, shape, or form on its territorial integrity or on any matters of potential compromise with the Russian aggressors. Right? But what we see in the polls that Sam cited and in the election itself is that the Ukrainian people are very much have positive attitudes toward Russia. Right, 50 to 60% of them express positive attitudes towards Russia in general. Right, even higher if you talk about Russians as people. Right, they still see themselves as sort of brotherly peoples, oddly enough. And right, taking into account all that's happened over the last 5 years, that's really remarkable. In other words, since the election of the previous government in 2014, it has pursued a fairly consistent agenda of trying to cut off all ties to Russia, to demonize all things Russian in terms of language and culture, cutting off Russian social media, cutting off Russian state television, cutting off, groups that were, sort of the communist, banning the Communist Party because it was tied to the Soviet past, renaming streets, more recently tearing down a statue of poor Marshal Zhukov, right? There's been this big push, but that doesn't seem to have had a polarizing effect on the population, right? And given that we've been, seen 5 years of war, that's really remarkable. So I think this is a remarkably positive background condition for politics moving forward, which is that we're not dealing with a Balkan scenario here where war has polarized the Ukrainian population and made reconciliation impossible. We actually see war leading to greater desire for reconciliation in this case, at least on the Ukrainian side. Right? And that partly what electing Jewish satirist who wants to, reconcile with the Donbass signals, is that, we can see, a pathway to progress in this case. I wouldn't rush to judgment now about what he's done since taking office, because Ukraine is it's a divided government, it's a mixed system, the president doesn't have that much power. You need to have a supportive coalition in the Rada. And this Rada was elected at the height of the conflict, in 2014, and they're completely unrepresentative of the population and popular attitudes at this point. And they are almost universally going to be thrown out of their seats in 3 weeks. Right? So if you look at all of the parties, the current shares of seats in the Rada, we're not going to see a lot of those people in a month from now. Right? The Yashko, the radical party, is going to be gone. All these parties are polling below the 5% threshold. Poroshenko's party might disappear. Right? So if you look at the polling right now, Sluga Narodu, which is Servant of the People, which is Zelensky's party, is close to 50%, just below 50% in the opinion surveys of who people are likely to vote for among likely voters in the upcoming elections. Opposition platforms, sort of the legacy of the Party of Regions, polling at around 18%, the second highest. But Kivshina, right? Yulia is going to still be around, right? Yulia Tymoshenko will still be a force, but diminished considerably, right? And Golos, which is Vakarchuk's party, so also a new face, a musician with a PhD in physics, and who has essentially pulled out the economic reform faction that had previously been supporting Petro Poroshenko and created his own party with this, the Golos party. They're now, polling at about 8.4%, and they are rapidly cutting into Poroshenko's support. So Poroshenko's support is going down for his European Solidarity Party. Golos is going up, right? And so it's very likely that all of the old faces are going to be gone, except for Yulia, right? And the opposition bloc, right? And so it's, in a few weeks from now, it's likely that we'll see Zelensky having, if his party does not get an outright majority in the Rada, it's going to be very close. It's going to be able to govern in coalition, either with opposition platform, which it probably will not do, or Golos, right, which it probably will do, right? In that case, you're going to have support for an aggressive anti-corruption agenda, and to some extent, certainly a willingness to compromise on the Donbass, right, as a way of resolving the conflict and regaining Ukraine's territorial integrity. That's the positive scenario from my perspective. But Ukrainian politics is always exciting, and people who hold power don't disappear easily or quietly very often. Right? So there are two, essentially, factions that are going to be very unhappy with the scenario that I just outlined. And those are the more right-leaning anti-Russian nationalists, what you could call the Galicians, because they're from a particular region of Ukraine, in Western Ukraine, and some of the oligarchs, right? Who, whereas Poroshenko had managed to maintain a regime where he was aggressive towards Russia and therefore garnered Western support, right, for his struggles against Russia. But at the same time didn't prosecute anybody on corruption and didn't do much in terms of trying to diminish the power of regional oligarchs or himself and his personal entourage, right? And so corruption was maintained. They maintain a conflictual relation with the West. And so some of those oligarchs are going to be expropriated, most likely. In other words, they're going to lose out from an anti-corruption campaign. And the nationalists are absolutely going to lose out. And the question is, what's going to happen to these people? They're not a majority, right? 73% of the population voted for Zelensky, right? These are not the people that, have a deep popular base. But they are well organized, and in some cases, they're well armed. And so that creates some potential for instability going forward, right? So you have these sort of nationalist paramilitary organizations, C-14, Samobrona, the National Druzhiny, You already had the previous integration of some of these far-right groups into the security services, so into the SBU, which is the successor organization of the KGB, and into the National Guard, into the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Avakov, is somebody who, sort of comes from the Maidan and brings some of these groups into the Ministry of Internal Affairs. It's not clear whether those groups are going to be able to, in some way, overturn and prevent action from taking place that leads towards reconciliation with Russia or reform. It's interesting that a month ago, a group of civil society activists published an open letter to Zelensky with a list of what they said were red lines not to be crossed. And should the president cross these red lines, such actions will inevitably lead to political instability in our country and the deterioration of international relations. Essentially a threat, he says. And the red lines include holding a referendum on the format and principles of a peaceful settlement in the Donbass. In other words, don't ask the people. Right? Conducting direct negotiations with Russia or with the Donbass separatist leadership, which, as Sam pointed out, 75% of the population supports the former and 55% supports the second option. Attempting to review the language law, which enforces the use of Ukrainian language at all levels of government and in education. It's been extremely unpopular. The Rada passed it after the presidential elections, right? So it's a lame duck Rada. Attempting to review the law on decommunization and condemnation of totalitarian crimes of the past, implementing any actions aimed at undermining or discrediting the Orthodox Church of Ukraine or supporting the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, restoring Russian social networks and Russian TV channels. In other words, doing everything that is essentially on Zelensky's platform is a red line, right? Any deviation from the policies of the previous government is a red line that could lead to potential political instability, right? That's not a very good recipe for stability going forward, since it's very likely that some of the things on that list are going to happen, particularly since the vast majority of the Ukrainian population wants them, and we've just had elections that put people in power who want to make that happen. So, to the extent that there's some bad news, it's Ukraine has a little bit of a deep state problem right now, right? That because of the past 5 years in power, you've got a lot of people in a position who are not necessarily going to go with the will of the people and their elected representatives. And so we'll see what happens after the parliamentary elections. You get a new Rada, you get new appointments. Klimkin's resignation will actually be accepted, right? You'll get new people at the top. But it probably won't take much before some of these disgruntled actors can take advantage of a crisis and engage in a sort of popular mobilization. Right? And we've seen this in Ukraine periodically over time, where well-organized and mobilized minorities overturn majorities. Right? We saw this in 2014. Just as background, a majority of the population never supported the Maidan. So these are just the facts of opinion in life in Ukraine. The other problem that Ukraine faces going forward is that the people want reform, but they don't really know what reform entails. And every single element of what anti-corruption reforms from our perspective would require has very little popular support in Ukraine. So things like the privatization of land, right? Which, because the government controls land, they lease it to oligarchs. Oligarchs get to profit from that land. The state often takes a loss on these lands. It would be much better to privatize this land and people could turn a profit. That's not likely to be popular among the population, right? Raising gas tariffs, ending all of these various schemes that have been used to siphon money out of the budget. There's a lot of popular opposition to this. So you have a situation where the population wants reform, wants an end to corruption, but in almost every measure of specific policies, they're very illiberal. And so that's going to create problems going forward. Ukraine's got a huge amount of debt. 53% of all Ukrainian loans were classified as non-performing. Right, so we're talking about a banking crisis that's on the horizon. They owe a tremendous amount internationally. They've got a $36 billion debt repayment coming over the next 3 years. And so there are just some fundamental structural problems here that, regardless of your intentions and all the goodwill in the world, is not going to bring Ukraine to a level of development of even Belarus, right, by the next 5 to 10 years. And so that makes it possible, if you have these organized groups that could potentially overturn a government in a crisis, they're going to have plenty of opportunities to do so.
Okay, so I'm not sure whether to be encouraged or discouraged by some of that, but thank you, Keith. Jacob, how are the Europeans looking at all of this?
Well, always the danger is that there is no such thing as Europe per se, but what does strike me is that I would not be so confident if I were sitting in Kiev today and were Mr. Zelensky about his geopolitical future and context. I think with the reintroduction of Russia into the Council of Europe, you have seen the high water mark of sanctions against Russia, at least as they are being implemented in Europe. And you've also seen the apex of the willingness of Germany and France, not to mention Italy, of course, to stand up for what the Ukrainians perceive as their own interests. I don't want to endow the Council of Europe with more importance than it deserves. The Europeans were clearly eager to have the Russians return partly on a monetary basis. I think the organization is struggling financially, and Russia owes about 87 million euros, which I suppose it will have to dig deep into its coffers to discover, but it presumably will pay them. And the other driver of this, clearly, both for France and perhaps even more for Germany, are economic interests. The German business, there was just a poll, 87% of the members of the Russian-German Chamber of Commerce indicated that they want better relations with Russia and they want to do business with Russia. The impetus of this is also, I think, the Trump administration. President Trump has called Germany a, quote, captive of Russia, primarily because of the Nord Stream 2 deal. I think what this Council of Europe decision indicates is that the Germans are not going to waver on Nord Stream 2. I don't know exactly how the Trump administration will react to that, but I do think we are seeing a Germany and France crab walking their way towards more independence from the United States. The other interesting wrinkle here is that Great Britain is no longer really much of a player in these decisions. We'll see what happens with Brexit, but you are seeing the locus of power shift towards Germany, which wants to work together to create a German Franco condominium in Europe. I do not believe that the Germans are prepared to fence out Russia. Instead, it makes sense, both from their financial perspective and from their geopolitical position, to try and pursue a new form of Ostpolitik, or détente with the East, which the idea began in the 1960s in Germany, and then was carried out in the 70s and 80s primarily by the Social Democratic Party. And it's interesting, if you look at Germany today, it is the German Foreign Minister, Heiko Maas, who is bearing the brunt of the brickbats, at least inside Germany, for this decision to readmit Russia to the Council of Europe. A Ostpolitik with Russia would constitute, they would have to have both the financial links, which they already do. I mean, they are existing right now, but the German industry is complaining about American sanctions or American-led sanctions on Russia. And once Chancellor Angela Merkel is gone, and interestingly, she has been having public physical episodes of trembling, I think you will find a larger debate emerging among the Christian Democrats in Germany about how to approach Russia. But I think all of this will be driven in many ways by their perceptions of the United States. There is talk in Germany and Europe more broadly about reaching out to China as a counterweight to the United States. But you also have the Russia factor. So I don't know what other people here think, but given Germany's history and France's as well, it would seem logical that they would try to forge a closer relationship with Russia, no matter what Washington thinks. And even if, with the wrinkle here, of course, is we don't know exactly how Trump himself is going to approach Russia, because the administration has taken a fairly hard line towards Moscow, even as Trump himself has refused to criticize Putin in any form or fashion. So there are question marks, but I think regardless of whether Trump is reelected or not, that the Europeans are starting to explore a more independent foreign policy, and that the policy of isolating Russia, which really took steam after the Russian invasion of Crimea, is beginning to erode.
Thank you. Well, an awful lot of food for thought there. We're now going to open up the discussion for questions and answers from the audience. Those of you that have questions, please let me know. I'll recognize you. Wait for the microphone, please, before asking your question. Please identify yourself before posing your questions. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask the first question. And it has to do with priorities. Zelensky ran his campaign on two big issues. One was anti-corruption, and the other was settling this war. Both of those have enormous popular support. Both of them, however, have some serious opposition within the elite. How much capital does Zelensky have to expend on these two things, and does he have to decide what's most important to him to operate on first? Can he take these one at a time, in other words? And is there a trade-off there? Is the capital that he expends, for example, on anti-corruption, not available to him to use in settling the war? So, thoughts on this?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I think that he's much more likely to get traction on settling the war, but settling the war, unfortunately, requires cooperation from the other side, which is the Russian side. So, he's going to need some assistance in that department. And the Russians may be just waiting until the Rada elections, till he's actually in a position of power. The sort of chaos with Klimkin and the foreign ministry. I wouldn't want to be negotiating with Ukraine as a partner right now, because the president really doesn't have control of the government. But, corruption, it's more likely that he'll gain traction on corruption by punishing some oligarchs and protecting others. That's just how things typically work. It's how Putin actually made progress initially as well. In other words, you single out some while having some support you on the side. And so clearly Kolomoisky is not going to be subject to the first, he's not going to be the first one under the gun. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens moving forward. I think there will be some high-level prosecutions, because that's the one thing that Poroshenko did not do. And that's not that hard to do when you control the courts and the prosecutor's office, which he will do.
On the question of priorities? So, I mean, the first answer is it depends on the outcome of the parliamentary elections to a certain degree and the extent to which he has a solid majority. But I just, my instinct would suggest that there's something to the implicit assertion that he's probably going to have to prioritize immediately, and that there's going to be limited bandwidth to pursue a major new initiative in the context of the settlement of the Donbass at the same time as pursuing dramatic steps in the anti-corruption context. But you might see then smaller steps on both rather than sweeping change. And I think ultimately, certainly for the settlement process, there are a number of smaller steps that you could imagine happening in the short term that would not require dramatic political capital expenditures, so to speak, in order to achieve, for example, the disengagement along the other parts of the conflict line that had already been agreed in 2016, actually following through on that. In some of these places, the forces are so close that just their closeness by itself it causes a lot of the periodic flare-ups. So that's a non-answer, but it's a good question.
Great. Francis.
Fran Burwell, Atlantic Council and McClarty Associates. A comment.
Got a microphone coming your way. Sorry.
A comment and a question. Jacob, I don't disagree with anything you said about the Europeans. They are moving away. They are looking for alternatives. The Iran sanctions, in particular, the reimposition of Iran sanctions hit them very hard. As well as we won't have to talk about tariffs, both on and potentially future. But I think in the Council of Europe decision, there's another factor, and that is that the Russians said that they would leave. And that would then, as I understand it, deny Russian citizens the ability to petition the European Court of Justice. Human rights, sorry. The bulk of the cases before the court right now are instigated from Russia, and it is seen as one of the things that human rights activists can use, albeit it's very slow. I don't pretend that the court is going to decide, but there is a symbolic gesture of having that ability there, and to have that recourse for Russian citizens. I know at least some of the countries who voted to let the Russians back in, it was this calculation that was very important to them. So, but let me ask about reform and try and get you all to go more deeply into the possibilities of Ukrainian reform, particularly in the energy sector. And with the eye to the Naftgaz-Gazprom negotiations, the current contract ends on December 31st. Under the best of circumstances, I expect we will see an agreement at 10 minutes past midnight on December 31st, given the warm relations between these two companies. But how do you see the possibilities for energy reform and then playing into that?
So transit, and that's a very good question. On the Parliamentary Assembly, by the way, I agree. I'm not sure this was driven by the broader dynamics that are dividing the U.S. and Europe on sanctions. There was Russia in the Council of Europe or out of the Council of Europe was the decision being faced, and the negative consequences of Russia's departure for any number of ways in which the Council of Europe, through including the European Court of Human Rights, have the ability to influence things there. There are over 50 conventions that Russia is party to as a result of its membership in the Council of Europe that would go away if it were to leave. So I would agree with that. But on the question of the energy sector, the transit contract and reform, I guess, in principle are linked. I don't want to venture into the question of reform, but I do think that the transit contract and the purchase contract, which is also coming to an end at the end of the year, are looming major problems on the horizon. I mean, on the one hand, the good news is that Nord Stream 2 will not be completed by the end of the year, so to a certain extent there's over at least the medium term, Gazprom will need transit through Ukraine to some degree, even if less than before, although Gazprom has announced that it has already filled the gas reservoirs in Europe, so the sort of supply that's already there, 2.5 times more at this point than they were last year, and they continue to fill the reservoirs precisely to avoid any consequences of a potential cutoff on transit through Ukraine. But which again raises the pressure on the Ukrainians in this context, as does the progress on Nord Stream 2 and Turk Stream coming online. So, but I think some sort of contract will be, Gazprom's going to need some degree of transit. The question is whether we can get there without another disruption or not. And at this point, I don't think that there is much, it doesn't seem like there's much effort being put into to have this be not a last minute outcome towards the end of the year, as you suggest, Brent. So, any thoughts, Keith?
Okay.
I think you,
Yeah, on the domestic side, which is where I think the reforms are most important, I think this will be the key test to see whether, there's all sorts of discussion about, Kolomoisky being the man behind the man, and Kolomoisky's very much earned a significant portion of his money from buying or getting subsidized gas from the state and selling it at a higher price. And so raising gas tariffs, ending those subsidies, is hurting those businesses, and Akhmetov as well, right? So those will be very sensitive in terms of his oligarchic support, and so if he moves forward with those, which I think is entirely likely, that'll be a good test of how extensive he is pursuing reform and whether he's actually independent of some of these oligarchs. So we'll just wait and see, but I think it's likely. Yeah.
Wayne Mary.
Thank you. Wayne Berry, the American Foreign Policy Council. Very, very fine discussion thus far, and I'd like to draw it out in two areas. One, Poroshenko ran on a platform of army, language, religion. And I'd like to ask the panel, even though that platform failed, those are not trivial issues in Ukraine and not just in the West. So I'd like the panel to discuss a bit about Zelensky's likely relationship with the newly autocephalous church and the difficulties that church will have at the national level and at parish levels in Ukraine in bringing autocephaly into reality in Ukraine, which is not been trivial in any country in which autocephaly has been achieved in the Orthodox faith. And the army, which is a very different organization from the grassroots up than it was 5 years ago. And how this new, very popular government is likely to relate to those two very, very important institutions, not just in the Ukrainian state, but in Ukrainian society. Secondly, we've talked about Europe, but how about the US of A? I mean, for the last 5 years, there's been largely consensus at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue in broad support of Ukraine, though the president himself has been a bit iffy about that. More recently, we've now had a situation in which the president's most, shall we say, aggressive lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, has chosen to inject Ukraine into the 2020 political campaign by raising questions about the role of people around Zelensky in the previous presidential campaign, trying to undermine Paul Manafort, being part of an anti-Trump conspiracy, so on and so forth. And that has involved a lot of people rather close to the Oval Office, including the president's son. And that has eased off for a while. But the relationship between key figures in the outgoing government, particularly Prosecutor General Lysenko, and Giuliani raises the question as to whether Ukraine is going to become an issue in the inevitably toxic atmosphere of the American presidential campaign, and whether the United States can continue to play a positive role in Ukrainian affairs, in Ukrainian politics, Ukrainian relations with the West during the period of the new Zelensky government. I know those are both rather challenging questions,
Those are
but I
two
think
big questions,
but I think you can handle them.
Okay, so would you like to divide and conquer on
We
this?
just did. I'm going to do the church. And
Okay,
No,
very good.
You can do both.
Oh, I'm going to do both. Okay. Okay, on the church, I think Zelensky made clear that he did not think that any parish should be pressured, and that to switch. And the majority of parishes are still with the Moscow Patriarchate. And Poroshenko is starting to use the SBU to put pressure on parish priests and investigating. I think that's going to stop. And I think if it organically runs its course one way or another, that's fine. I think that you're going to see a lot less direct state intervention on this. This was Poroshenko's personal project. It is definitely not something that is a priority for Zelensky, and he is, in many ways, he supports the diversity of Ukraine, both linguistic diversity, religious diversity, and in general, he accepts that Ukraine is not. He doesn't have a cultural project for the country, a homogenizing cultural project. And that was very much part of his campaign and very much part of why he won. So, and on the army, support for Zelensky was very high in the army. And so I think that, one of the things that, when he gave his initial campaign speech was, part of being commander-in-chief is making sure your soldiers come home, right? And so, making the case that it's regular soldiers that have been hung out to dry while people have enriched themselves at the upper levels, buying weapons from Russia and selling them to the Ukrainian government at a profit and things like that. So I think he's on secure ground there. I think you're right that, there are a lot of veterans out there and there are a lot of families that are touched by the conflict. But it seems like a lot of those people would like it to be resolved.
Okay, do we want to talk about the,
you asked the question.
okay, great.
I was just as a footnote to Fran's remark, yes, there was a lot of the defenders in Europe of political defense in office mentioned the human rights, but it has created an uproar in Germany and elsewhere.
Yes,
I don't think that it was simply an act of charitable benevolence upon the part of the European countries to ensure that Russia returned and didn't leave wholesale. But on Wayne's question about Ukraine, there are a couple things that occur to me. Well, first of all, we know that the election cycle is going to be extremely volatile, so we don't actually know what's coming. Second, the Ukraine issue is pretty exotic for an American public to grasp. And then I would say third, the problem with the Mueller report, of course, was that it was an investigation in search of a crime. And I think you would probably run into difficulties in trying to explain exactly. It's too complicated what allegedly would have been happening in Ukraine. That doesn't mean that there won't be an attempt to do it. And then finally, the waters were considerably muddied by Trump's imprudent avowal that he would, in fact, accept foreign help and that was perfectly legitimate. So I think, whether Ukraine becomes an issue, I'm skeptical that it will, but it's always possible.
Okay, here, on the left, yep.
Based upon what Keith and Sam have said, and Jacob, it looks like Crimea is a done deal. There's nothing we can do. We need to accept the fact it's not going to come back no matter how long we keep the sanctions on. As you said, Europe is backing off. The Ukrainian people seem to have accepted it, so it's over.
So the survey, there's a little bit more in the survey, Sam, that he didn't mention. About 18% of Ukrainians surveyed think that they should write off their current territorial losses, both in the Donbass and in Crimea, right? Which is a pretty big number, actually, 20%. And I think if you asked about Crimea, it would probably be higher. But I don't think, you don't need to write it off. You just say, we don't accept the annexation of Crimea, just like the United States didn't accept the annexation of the Baltic states. And, see how things play out in the next 50, 60 years.
I would just add to that there is a significant distinction between the sanctions that were imposed related to the annexation of Crimea and those related to the Donbass. And I have no expectation that the sanctions on Crimea, even the European ones, will be modified. And that has really made it quite difficult for Russia to fully incorporate Crimea economically. Has essentially created a zone that is very difficult. I mean, basically, there's no Western businesses that will operate there, and Russian businesses with presence in Western countries also can't operate there. So those are a whole separate set from the ones that were linked to settlement of the Donbass conflict.
I think that at least the Europeans wrote it off the day it occurred. There was a quote a couple months after the seizure of Crimea in which the former German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt created a national controversy when he said that it was, quote, totally understandable that the Russians seized Crimea. I mean, and that's coming from someone, again, who is in the Social Democratic Party, not. So I think Crimea is gone as long as Russia exists in its current form.
Yeah, we're not going to make India give back Goa. There are these historic examples of annexations where we were very upset initially, but people let them slide. But, Cyprus, we weren't happy when Turkey invaded Cyprus. May see a unified Cyprus someday. I just think with these things, you can't make it a condition of having normal relations, because it is such a long-term, distant prospect for resolution.
Okay, you're on the right.
So I'm Chris Franson with the State Department. I work with Ambassador Volker, and I spent 3 years in Embassy Kiev from 2014 to 2017. I think I'm contractually obligated to mention that we did the Crimea Declaration, which pretty much said that we will not recognize. It was modeled on the Wells Declaration, the idea being that we will not accept, but we're also not saying this is a precondition for engagement. So I wanted, as someone involved in the negotiations with the Russians, to sort of see what do you think what more can be done to try and get peace? I mean, you sort of said that, well, the people want peace and Zelensky is following the old policies, and yet it sort of implies that Ukraine has the power to create peace on its own. When Russia controls Donbass completely, I mean, they choose the leaders, they fund the army, they set the budgets, they run the ministries, they have commissars up and down the line of control, the chain of command in the military, and direct negotiations with the people there, it's not going to help. I mean, we have seen directly that when you negotiate with them, if the quote-unquote separatists say something wrong, the Russians correct them. And so say, no, wait, what he meant to say was da-da-da-da. So negotiating with separatists doesn't necessarily add any value, since they don't have authority to make any decisions. And we also know directly that Russia's goal is to have an autonomous Republic of Donetsk and Luhansk with a veto over Ukraine's foreign policy. So there is a fundamentally different view of what Minsk entails, and they think that's what they should get, and Medvedchuk has put forward proposals for that. So is that something that Ukraine should give up on? Should they trade away, create a Republic of Srpska model where they lose their foreign policy? Or should they just keep the process going? I mean, what would you suggest they try to do given these parameters?
You start.
If you are to read the Minsk agreements, and particularly the document known as Minsk II in detail, there is no, of course, formal mention of the question of the influence of the proposed autonomous regions on Ukraine's foreign policy, although there is a provision for a adoption of a new constitution that would be negotiated with representatives of the, to abbreviate it, the separatist regions, and we've seen, at least in some of the drafts that were leaked, that they of course did put provisions in there to that effect. However, that seems to be at least subject to negotiation. What I would say is that things that could be done unilaterally was sort of the concrete question. One would be to take the question of special status out of the exclusively Donbass context and actually decentralize power throughout all the regions of Ukraine. In other words, every region has special status, which is something that people who've looked at Ukrainian governance since 1991 have been talking about the need for. That is significant decentralization of authority on any number of non-foreign policy related issues, from education to cultural policy, etc. But even beyond that, in terms of fiscal powers and so on, at the moment, even though there has been some decentralization since 2014, it has been not to the level of the region, but to the level of even more local communities, which I don't think at least answers the bill on this score. And there have been some interesting proposals. In fact, Sergei Kozelia wrote a piece about what that might look like. That is a new center-region relation structure that would be more consistent with the settlement in Donbass. So that might be one thing, because I don't think politically, regardless of even if it could get through the Rada, over the long term, a highly asymmetric, almost confederal structure whereby two regions in the country have these totally disproportionate rights compared to the rest of the country would be viable. I mean, that wouldn't really, I don't think would work in many polities, and certainly not one where there are significant differences over a number of important issues. There are, though, other things, so beyond that question, such as the disengagement, where there are, I mean, this will not lead to a settlement, but it certainly will further, without disengagement, you're not going to get there, right? So, I mean, along the line of contact. And it is true that the Ukrainians have been gradually retaking parts of what was the no man's land, essentially, in the last few years. So, there's another thing, concretely. But in the big picture, the irony about Minsk, right, is that it was essentially a victor's peace imposed upon Ukraine at the barrel of a gun. And it reflects Russia's victory on the battlefield, essentially. So that it is undesirable for Ukraine to implement is not surprising in itself. But we should also therefore recognize that Russia's would be prepared, I think, to alter to follow through on their security commitments if they thought there were any prospect of actually getting this thing implemented. And I think from the very beginning, they were convinced by Poroshenko's attitude that there was never going to be any possibility of the political components of Minsk being implemented, so therefore they had no incentive to take the steps they had admittedly committed to doing immediately, but nonetheless. So I don't think we know what Russian attitude would be if they did see political will to move ahead on settlement in Kiev. Now, I'd also add that we don't know also the extent to which Russia might be willing to be flexible if there were to be a kind of negotiation after that process would have gotten off the ground. So I wouldn't rule out completely that there's some degree of flexibility, particularly on this question of codifying the region's authority over foreign policy, which I just think, no Ukrainian president can really agree to in any case.
Yeah, I think it's hard to say because Poroshenko had so much to gain from an ongoing conflict, and Zelensky doesn't. And so we'll see whether a change in leadership leads to some improvement in the quality of negotiations. I think that it's not certain in my mind, at the very least, that Russia is only going to accept a Bosnia outcome here, and that they might accept autonomy within Ukraine that doesn't, basically those regions have cultural autonomy, tax autonomy, essentially just pockets within Ukraine, but they don't have any control over Ukrainian foreign policy, but they continue to vote in Ukrainian national elections and things like that. I think that's possible, but we don't know, right? We have to see what Russia is willing to accept. If I were negotiating it from the Ukrainian side, I would put on the table either autonomy or we recognize your secession with the existing line of contact and goodbye. Better to cauterize the wound.
Here on the left-hand side.
Yes, thank you very much. It's really a interesting discussions. My name is Paweł Gotowski. I'm DCM at the Polish Embassy here in Washington, D.C. So it's an honor to be the only diplomat in the room, probably. I just wanted, it was striking to me that there's been so much stress put on the decision by the Council of Europe. I don't want to diminish the importance of this body, but I just wanted to point out to another very important fact that points out to some more unity within in Europe and among the Europeans. Just recently, the European Union rolled over the Ukraine-related sanctions, and the sanctions has been in place for like over 4 years now, and we've been successful in keeping the unity not only among the Europeans but also with the United States. So this is very much appreciated, and thank you also for the support of the State Department for this unity and this cohesion among the transatlantic members. And by the way, Poland and 6 other countries strongly protested about this decision by the Council of Europe, and in protest they left the session of the Assembly, and will be probably taking up another steps to protest against this decision. But again, within the European Union, I think the sanctions are much more important instrument in pushing for more stability and against this aggression of Russia. My question to you is, what would be your, and we, by the way, and we don't write off Ukraine. Poland has been very supportive of the Ukrainians, and we are striving to help them to the extent that we can to help them stand on their feet. And my question to you would be, what would be your advice to countries like Poland and other countries in the region who really want to support Ukraine, the reforms, and also push back on the Russian aggression? Because part of the problem in Ukraine, of course, they have the problems, internal problems are enormous. But part of the problem, very important one, is that Russia is not playing in good faith and is not acting towards resolving of this conflict. So what would be your advice? What your advice would be to countries like Poland and other countries in the region? Thank you.
I would say first and foremost, don't discourage reconciliation. So I think we really have developed a narrative and a strategy about this is the point at which we push back against Russian aggression. And if Ukraine wants to settle this conflict, we should let them. And we should assist them on that path and not use this as a way to tame the Russian bear, right? There's a danger that we are really having a Russia policy, not a Ukraine policy, and it's going to have a negative impact on Ukraine over time. And so I do think that we don't want the Sudetenland precedent, but we also don't want to prevent a peaceful settlement that's going to be good for Ukraine's long-term development here. In terms of reform, I think that's a tougher one, but the reality is Ukraine has really reached a point of like a threshold, a popular threshold, where they're no longer willing to accept the status quo, much as Moldova has recently too, right? There's just, we've kind of had this politics for the last 25 years, and it's reaching the end of its life. And so the Europeans can potentially step in now with some additional support. This is a time where actually some additional support might be positive, right? It's like the alcoholic who's ready to be cured. Right, they're ready to enter the 12-step program at this point, and so I would say Ukraine's going to need some assistance on its debt financing, and if they make progress on some of these reforms, then we should help them.
Okay, Aram.
Thank you. Aram Baksh, an occasional contributor to the National Interest, and was in the Nixon, Ford, and Reagan White Houses. It occurred to me there's an element that's quite outside the Ukraine that we haven't touched on. It might be marginal, but it could have long-term significance, and that is, I was just thinking, if I were the foreign minister of any of the 3 Baltic republics right now, how would I be viewing the rather successful results so far of Russia's policy with a former satellite, and how might I feel, and how might Europe and the actions of the European Council and all be affected in terms of any future extension of this Russian style of policy to the Baltic?
Who wants to tackle this?
I suspect from the slant of your question, Arm, that we see it similarly. I don't think that I'm not trying to argue that the Council of Europe is of vast significance, but look, I do think it is symbolically important that, and the reason there is an uproar in Germany itself, it's coming from the media and from other figures, not so much in the political class, is that it is seen as a repudiation of the stand that Europe originally took, that it is in fact rewarding Russia's seizure of Crimea, and that the Russians, if you take the view, say, of Garry Kasparov, who called this worse than Munich in 1938, then you're essentially saying, then you believe that Europe is saying crime pays. Now, there's another view possible, which is that, Germany and France, in fact, operate on realpolitik principles more comfortably than often does the United States, and that they're just bowing to reality, that Russia is, in fact, a more important country than Ukraine.
I think the Baltic states are in a fundamentally different position as members of NATO, and thus with U.S. security guarantees. So I don't know that I would compare the two, but I would say that I would draw a distinction between the policy of so-called isolation, or diplomatic isolation, that was attempted in the aftermath of the events of 2014, and the sanctions policy more broadly, and sort of overall policy on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I mean, the quote-unquote isolation, the attempt to isolate Russia diplomatically, in my view, was never going to work. And therefore it was only a matter of time when it was going to be walked back. And the US arguably did it even sooner than at least the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe did. I remember, I think it was probably maybe early 2016 or maybe late 2015 when John Kerry went to Sochi and met with both Lavrov and Putin. And the question was, well, what happened to the isolation policy at that point? So, I mean, the idea that major powers such as the U.S., France, and Germany are not going to engage with Russia was one of these things that was very clear that at some point there was going to have to be a climb down, and it was really only a matter of time. I don't think that's true about other elements of the policy that has been adopted by the EU and the US in the aftermath of 2014. Even if one might have a different opinion of those things, I don't think that had that same sort of inevitable. I didn't see it as inevitably likely to fail as I did this one.
Okay, Dimitri.
I would like to try to respond, and Dimitri Simes, I work at the center. I would like to respond to Mr. Anderson. The first thing I believe the United States can do to explore real Russian flexibility or a lack of it is for you, together with Kurt Volker, to go.
They're asking for a microphone.
Is for you, together with Mr. Volker, to go to Moscow, because the Russians have a grudging respect for Ambassador Volker, and they heard a lot of good things from him, including from John Herbst, and I would say occasionally from me. And I think that they would consider this quite significant if he came to Moscow and he explored to what extent the Russians are prepared to talk seriously. I think that today the Russian position is a very hard line. One reason it's a very hard line, because they don't believe that an agreement is plausible. And they clearly thought it was not plausible under Poroshenko. Now I think there may be an opening. I do not know how real is this opening, whether it is sufficient in terms of cutting any kind of a deal, but why not to talk to them? And I agree with you completely about Donetsk and Lugansk. Their leaders are, well, how to put it delicately, not quite independent. I also think that the Russians, exactly as you said, would not mind to allow Donetsk and Lugansk, if they become a part of Ukraine, to have a veto power over the Ukrainian foreign policy. I would be shocked if they would insist on that, if there would be a possibility of a deal. The only thing I think they would insist upon is that Ukraine would not join NATO in any foreseeable future, since to the best of my knowledge, there is very little likelihood that Ukraine would become a NATO member in any foreseeable future. I guess you can talk about what does foreseeable future mean, and how you would not make a commitment for this not to happen at all, but at the same time would provide the Russians with a security cushion. Why I think a deal can be negotiated? Well, because the Russian economy is in a very bad shape. We talked about opinion polls in Ukraine. Let's talk for a minute about opinion polls in Russia. What they called a Crimean consensus is no more. People don't like to pay for Crimea. They like even less to pay for Lugansk and Donetsk. If they see Zelensky as a real possibility in terms of dealing with him, I think it would be very difficult for Putin to say no. I also think that from everything I have seen, and I never was in Lugansk and Donetsk, but I talked to people, including their leaders, who spend a lot of time there. I think it's a mess. It's a corrupt mess. There is very little likelihood that the Russians would want this situation to continue indefinitely if there is any realistic solution. The Russians clearly do not want for these two republics to join Russia. It would be very expensive and very controversial. They do not like the status quo because they're paying completely for these republics. So no, I think the situation is very difficult, but I don't think it is entirely hopeless. And my impression is that with a notable exception of membership for Ukraine in the near future, I think that almost everything else can be negotiable. As far as the Crimea is concerned, I don't see how Crimea can realistically be returned anytime soon. But you know, again, I was not in Crimea, but I talked to people who spent a lot of time there, including Crimean officials. Crimea is also becoming a mess. It's a huge disappointment, and not just because of Western sanctions, but because of growing corruption. There is a so-called Abkhaz phenomenon. Yeah. By that I mean, these people like to be a part of Russia, except they don't like the Russians to own property and to have real influence there. Yeah. I don't think that you will see Crimea going back to Ukraine anytime soon, but some kind of a meaningful opening to Ukraine, I think within the realm of possibility.
Thank you all. I think we've reached the end of our allotted time. I think it's been a very interesting discussion, so thank you, and thank you to the panelists.
Great to meet you.